Howdy folks, Brian Cusco here at Triple B to bring you another great talk from Herpeton. This week we're going to hear from Scott Stahl. Scott is an exotic vet here in the United States and he has one of the largest practices that is dedicated to reptiles. In today's talk, he's answering questions from the crowd and we'll cover topics such as the possibility of vaccination against diseases in reptiles, metabolic bone disease, or what I should probably refer to now as nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism, and even IBD. Scott was one of my favorite speakers of the event, and he had a great attitude, which goes a very long way with me, as you all know. He's a wealth of information for all of us, keepers, breeders, and hobbyists alike. So without further ado, you're watching Triple B TV.
Well, I tell you what, it is an honor to be here today, and I don't know, I think you're all probably feeling the same as I am. The energy in this room with each lecture has just been fabulous, and so I feel I'm very excited to be part of it. When Alan and I talked about me coming out to help and to give some lectures, he said that we ended up having some people not come, and so he asked me if I could do another lecture, and I said, well, why don't we do a Q&A, because there's always people with burning questions about issues that they're having. And so we decided to kind of squeeze that in. So really this is the next 30 minutes or 30 to 40 minutes is about you guys with questions. I'm going to try to answer them as best I can. And so that's what we'll do. And if there aren't any, then I do have a few slides I can go through to show you a few things. But I'm hoping that you guys will have questions. But if you give me a minute or two, I just want to mention these hunky-looking guys up here, except for the guy in the blue shirt. But you recognize Philippe over here. This was back in the day. This is one of his weapons here. That's his sprayer, mist sprayer. And when you visit him, you have to be careful because he's always spraying the animals. But anyway, he and I met way back with another mentor of mine, Bob Mayhew. I think I saw Bob enter the room a little. There he is back there. And so Philippe was talking about his aha moment, and everybody, Nick just mentioned it, and Petra mentioned it, that we've all had these moments where we said, hey, wow, this is a passion. This is what I want to get up in the morning and do. And so I was a veterinary student back in 1988, and I was at a practice in Los Angeles, which is one of the very first all-exotic animal veterinary practices in the country. Walter Roscoff and Rick Werpel were the owners of that practice, and they were kind enough to let me come and learn from them. But one of the things that was going on was that UC Davis was having the Northern California Herpetological meeting, and so I was dying to go to that meeting. So I said, what the heck? I knew this crazy guy named Bob Mayhew was breeding bearded dragons at the time. So I actually called him and said, hey, I'm a lowly vet student. Is there any chance that I can get your eye with you to Davis? So next thing you know, he's like, oh, yeah, that'll work out all right. So he and Philippe and I, in a VW bus that broke down about 4 times, I think, on the way, made our trip to Davis. And for me, it was a life-changing opportunity. And I really thank those guys for taking me under the way. Very kind of them to do that, perfect stranger. But I think I got a lot of energy from them. And I decided at that point in time that my goal was to try to contribute to herpetoculture from the veterinary side, from the veterinary medical side. And so it's, again, to be able to come back almost 30 years later and talk to you guys, it's exciting for me. I have a exotic animal exclusive practice in the Washington, D.C. area, Northern Virginia area. We do just exotic pets, no dogs and cats. And I'll be honest, I've heard many people say it today that this reptile thing is not a money-making adventure, and it's certainly not on the veterinary side either. So I basically make my living treating mostly rabbits and birds, and then I do the reptiles because I have a passion like you guys do. I'd probably be starving to death if I was trying to make it as only a reptile veterinarian. That's still a difficult thing to do. So one thing I'll mention is that we as veterinarians, especially those of us in the reptile industry, we're doing it mostly for a love and a passion, just like you guys sitting in your seats here today. We want to work with you, and we want the opportunity to learn. I've learned so much this morning with these talks. It's been fabulous. So anyway, so let's move on. Herpetoculture, we've been talking here about all these advances over the last 40 years, and so herp medicine and surgery has also advanced as well. We've made a lot of great inroads into what we can offer. And I think that this book that we're talking about, it's a 1,500-page book, and it has 120 authors, including myself writing a number of chapters, and Steve Divers, we're the co-editors on this book. And we tried to include every single discipline you can think of, so everything from oncology and cancer and surgery and ophthalmology to alternative medicines, chiropractic, you name it, it's in this book. And we tried to elevate the level of what's out there for us, for how we can help these animals that we all love so much. And I think that this is the thing that I want to try to pass on today. I've heard so many of you talk about your passion, and I honestly feel like that these animals that we're all talking about, they deserve veterinary medicine and veterinary medical care as well. And for us to continue to keep ignoring that part of it and saying, oh, vets don't know anything about reptiles and amphibians. That's not true, okay? And there aren't many of us, I will agree, but we do, and we're passionate about it, just like you guys. And I think if we're having animals die, or we're not having success with certain animals, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, we didn't do well with that species, and oh, they came in and they all, well, we should have been trying to figure out why that is, and trying to work with a veterinarian to figure out ways that we can do things better, to elevate everything that we're all doing. That's a part of it as well, right? And so we want to work with you guys on that. One of the things that I wanted to mention was that we can work with you on a production management basis. If you look back at what goes on in the industry, you know, veterinarians that work with the dairy farmers or beef cattle, they understand that there's a process that goes on where we're trying to make a living. And so the goal is not, as a veterinarian, to take all your potential profits and use them up on veterinary medicine. It's to help you actually to do better, to produce healthier animals and to have higher fecundity. Maybe we can produce more animals if we can figure out ways to integrate production management from the veterinary side into it. Maybe there's some things that we could be doing differently. So there's some of us that are out there thinking like that. In my office, you can call me and we'll do a phone consultation. Most reptile veterinarians, or most reptile folks like you guys that are doing the kind of work that you're doing, you're not interested in coming and sitting in the waiting room with a bunch of dogs and cats and holding your tortoise on your lap to come see us as the veterinarian. So those days are not there anymore. We have other ways that we can work together as a team, and we understand that. So what you have to understand is that what you need from me as the herp vet is the knowledge that I've learned in my head after treating thousands of animals, not necessarily for me to pick up that individual animal that you have and maybe treat that animal. It's what's happening in your group of animals, and how can we learn from that individual animal that's having an issue to correct things in production and do a better job with that. So I want you to realize that those things are available. And tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit about reproductive management. I'm going to show you some of the new things that we're working on there, and so we'll share that with you tomorrow as well. And then along that line again, this book that we finished up, also remember that the ARAV is an organization, the Association of Reptile and Amphibian Veterinarians, and we have about 1,000 veterinarians now that are members of this, and we have a conference every year where we have 3 or 4 days of discussing cases that we've worked on and progress that we've made. And so this is the book that we're talking about. We've donated, unfortunately, unlike Nick, I haven't sold out all these yet. There's still many available, but it actually just came out in February, and I've donated a book to the auction that we can sign if you guys would like. So we'll have a book, and then there's one in the back too if everybody wants to look at it, and there's author cards as well. So the book, it costs about $180, depending on whether you get a discount or not, but I think that you'll find that the book has a lot of conservation-related issues in it as well, and reproductive and breeding-related things that you'll find useful. So anyway, so now I'm ready to open it up for questions, if anybody has any specific questions. Yeah. Yeah, that I'm not sure about. I don't know how we can make. Well, I will tell you that, unfortunately, I'm an avian veterinarian as well, and the avian community is very organized and has done a very good job of grouping together and understanding when a disease arrives that they get together and they find funding and will get money available for research. So it's a little tougher on the reptile side. Most of the The information that we get on viral diseases from reptiles and a lot of the infectious diseases are based on one of the universities having a professor or someone that's very interested in learning about the virus. And unfortunately, as you know, a lot of the research that takes place with infectious diseases of animals is based on money, really, and the amount of money that can come in to fund the research. And unfortunately, this is why it's taken us almost 20 years to learn that, you know, the inclusion body disease is now been identified as a reptorhinovirus. And so it took that long for us to get there. So part of it is us as a community, if we're worried about this situation, we can fund some of the research. There's still a whole lot we don't know about nidovirus, you know, as Philippe was mentioning earlier today. We're finding a lot more of it. You know, one of the things that's happening right now is that we're identifying a lot more infectious agents than we used to because of the ability to look at genetics and things of this nature. And we're using DNA as a way to analyze that. We're looking at, we're finding these organisms attached to these animals. But part of the problem with like nidovirus, for instance, is that we don't always know that if nidovirus is there, whether it's actually causing disease or not. We may actually have carrier animals that have nidovirus and are asymptomatic. We had a similar thing happen in the avian community where a disease called bornavirus was identified. And a lot of people like freaked out when we first identified bornavirus, and they actually euthanized birds that were positive for bornavirus. And then we found out later that 40% of the avian pet bird population carries bornavirus and are completely asymptomatic. And so all those animals that were euthanized early on were euthanized for no reason because many of those animals would have never had any clinical symptoms. So it is sort of it's exciting about, you know, the new technology that we have with DNA, but it's also confusing because we always have to, we have to take a virus like nido and then we have to place it it has to be proven that that virus is causing issues. And certainly we know that nidovirus probably is. I think the problem that I have in helping I have a lot of collections that I help from around the country, and I do a lot of consulting work for my clients that don't live in Virginia, and we basically, I help them to understand if they have a positive animal for nidovirus, what that might mean. And what we basically try to do is figure out whether it makes sense, how to manage that case, whether that's an animal that potentially should be isolated, probably so, or whether it has clinical symptoms that should be potentially removed from the collection. So it's very complicated. And one of the problems that's happening with nidovirus right now is that a lot of people want to continue to ignore it, and that's not good. That's probably not going to get us where we need to go. There are some laboratories that potentially may be taking samples and don't have proper benchmarks for how the quality control that's being done, and so the samples are being run and people are getting positive results. And again, there's primers that are involved in producing a quality test, and some of these labs that can do like 5 or 6 PCR tests for $30. Well, it's kind of like everything else in life. You get what you pay for, and if you're getting that many samples for that amount of money, then you know how good are the quality controls. The lab that I use tells me that it's expensive to have proper controls to make sure that these virus results are accurate, if you will. The other thing is that there needs to be caution in the public sending in samples, because if you're buying, for instance, if you're buying a snake and someone told you they tested it for nidovirus and it was negative, well, if it wasn't done by a professional person, then how can you be sure that they actually they could take a swab and, you know, slide it across their computer and send that in and it's negative from the lab. They get a report from the lab, but you don't know whether that sample was collected properly. So there's a lot of logistics that go into that. So I understand your question. I think it's a difficult thing. I think the idea is you need to try to find a veterinarian that you trust. And if you have something like a positive nido animal, then you really need to probably consult with a veterinarian that's knowledgeable about that virus and truly get all the information that you can about what it really might mean. So anyway, but that's part of it. We're all learning, and hopefully we can continue to do better. So let's get another question. What he's asking me is about some of the Chihuahua that you have. These are females, right? And it's after egg laying. And that sometimes he'll notice maybe that the back looks like, we call it kyphosis or scoliosis, where maybe just the tail in this case, okay. And actually there's an example. This animal in this slide actually has what we call nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism. It's a young growing crusty, and this kinking of the tail and unfortunately kinking of the spine is often related to, not taking in enough calcium when they're young and growing. So one thing to understand about, so the old term that we used was metabolic bone disease, but we try not to use that terminology because metabolic bone disease includes a whole bunch of different types of bone diseases. The one that most of us are talking about in our reptile herp community is nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism, because it's related to the animals not getting enough mineral or vitamin D and or sunlight, depending on how they're able to metabolize their vitamin D. So it's related to a nutritional problem. Your parathyroid gland is the gland that's in your body that regulates calcium absorption. And so if you're not getting enough mineral, let's say calcium in your diet, then your parathyroid gland gets pinged and says, hey, we're in a crisis here. You have to have calcium in your bloodstream for your brain to function and your nerves to fire. So it looks for calcium wherever it can find it. And where's the most convenient place for calcium in your body? It's in your bones, right? So that parathyroid gland becomes overly active or hyper and begins to resorb and pull mineral out of the bones in order to have function of the neurological system and the gastrointestinal tract. And then what happens is we get this kind of thing where we get deformities of bone structures, like this poor little guy, his mandibular and maxillary bones are like rubber, so hence the name rubber jaw, but again, we prefer not to use that term as well. So the idea is that we want to get away from saying metabolic bone disease, we say nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism. And to be honest with you, it's important to also understand that there are, this is something that typically happens in young growing animals. What's happening in young growing animals is they have this high demand for mineral and calcium in their diet because they're growing, and those bones, as they grow, need to have that mineral to continue to grow. It's actually a very rare disease in adult animals, and it's one of the more common things that I find that people still think that they see nutritional secondary. They'll have an older animal and they'll think that it's having a calcium deficiency. Well, that very rarely happens in an older, mature animal because that animal's already grown to its mature size. We all know that reptiles do continue to grow throughout their lives, very small amounts as they get mature, but they don't have that same demand like they do when they're young and growing. The difference is when we have productive females. These girls they're utilizing very large amounts of calcium to put into the yolk material. The yolk itself actually has a lot of mineral in it, and then into shelling the egg as well, if they're a oviparous animal, gecko in this case. What I think might be happening for you, the other thing that will happen is that if those females they're not only are they utilizing a lot of calcium for the eggs, but they're also using a lot of energy. And so there's actually stored musculature in what we call the epaxial muscles that run along the back and in the tail. And that's one of the main places where the body will take energy to put into, again, calories for those eggs. Well, I think what's happening with your animals is that those girls are depleted, maybe hydration-wise, but also certainly caloric-wise and muscle mass-wise and fat energy store-wise. So what probably is happening is that as that musculature is lost along the spine, you see these changes in the tail, and what you're probably seeing is a loss of muscle mass in that area as a result of the energy that went into those eggs that she laid.
It's not a leopard gecko. It doesn't have that.
Right. That's correct.
Pulling it from the tail.
And then once you hydrate her and you get her back on food again and she fills out, then that musculature fills back in, and that waviness or that you're seeing there goes away. Because the one thing that happens with this is, like, one of the reasons I have this Chuho up here is that because once you have these spinal changes in a young growing animal that has nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism, you can get the calcium in the bones to become firm and hard again, but you can never get these irregularities to fix. And that's a permanent thing that will be with that animal for life. So your females, it wouldn't be possible for her bones to kind of do crazy things and kink up like that and then go back to normal again, probably related to that, unless there was a fracture or something like that involved. So that's probably not something that's happened. And one of the reasons that this happens so dramatically with the mandibular and maxillary bones is because there's a lot of musculature that's attached to those bone structures in order to allow these animals to masticate. So when you take away what we call the mineral portion of the bone, all that's left is what we call the osteoid. And the osteoid is the soft bone portion, and it has no strength. So those muscles pull back, and that's why you see these animals that have what we call brachiocephalic syndrome, like the bulldogs and boxers where their faces are mushed. And you might even see an older animal that has a face that's deformed or abnormal because maybe it recovered from nutritional secondary hyperthyroidism as a young animal, but the skull never went back to a normal shape after that. So is that helpful? All right. Another question? Yeah. That's a great, so the idea is that I do think that if the female is running out of energy as she's producing ova, that you'll see a lot of these kinking and irregularities when these guys hatch out, or they'll just be weak. And so that is one of the things that you will see. And when we say scoliosis, of course, means curvature of the spine. Kyphosis means, you know, up and down changes or whatever. And I do think that it is related. It can also be potentially incubation temperatures or other related incubation problems where the animal is trying to develop, and part of the development is the bone structure, and something isn't going right. But I would tell you that if you were seeing that consistently, it might be that the females are potentially running out of either energy or mineral.
I find it more at the end of the breeding season after they've really been working very hard than the last clutch might have more signs of that than earlier on.
So Andrew said it was at the end of the season that he would see that, right? Yeah. So very interesting. So, and again, that's probably because they've depleted their energy sources and their mineral sources, so the amount of energy that's going into those eggs has been reduced, and you're seeing abnormalities in those babies at hatching. So. Yes, they definitely can recover, and this is a disease that we can treat. Unfortunately, though, it's as I was telling you, they may end up with, the face may end up being abnormal. They may have an underbite or an overbite or a scissor. The mouth might not close properly, but they can recover. I mean, these guys, you know, this one obviously is an adult, so it recovered. Both of these guys probably recovered with treatment, but these are pet animals, of course. So, you know, in a breeding situation, it wouldn't be logical to spend a lot of energy possibly trying to correct that at this stage, but certainly on the pet side, we can fix these guys. The important thing is to try to figure out, you know, this is a crested gecko I put up here as an example. It's back to the stuff that a lot of you have been talking about today. We got to do better, you know, caring for the animals, and it really relates to, you know, doing a better job with nutrition, apparently it's all in the dust, right, according to Petter, right? We need calcium carbonate dust or whatever flying through the air, you know. So the idea is we got to do a better job with what we're feeding these guys, and so, you know, the insectivorous lizards were always in a battle, you know, because most insects are deficient in mineral and high in phosphorus, so we've got this imbalance. So we have to correct that not only by dusting them, but also by feeding you know, we got to take good care of our insects, you know, you are what you eat kind of thing. And then we've also learned that not only do we need to gut load them with a good quality food, but we need to dust them. And there's been many studies now to prove that both of those things oftentimes are necessary in order to allow that cricket, if you will, to become a nutritious food. And then one of the things that we've learned is that you do need to supplement with vitamin A and also a vitamin D calcium source. And many species of lizard do need preformed vitamin A. Beta-carotenoids will not suffice, at least in some of the products that are available on the market right now. So in other words, if you're doing a beta-carotene only multivitamin, you will begin to see issues with hypovitaminosis A, okay? And that's shedding problems, hemipenal plugs, respiratory disease, a whole variety of things. So it's important to use a preform, and the Reptivite is one of the ones that we recommend, ZoomEd, because they're here today and they're helping us out, so that's good. And we found that they have a good vitamin A source in their product that is preformed, and I've just been using that one for a number of years, so that does work. And then again, for the crested, of course, it's very important to use a quality diet. This is some old packaging here. I'm showing that the vintage, I think we call that, with the silver. But anyway, obviously with that, we have an ability with these frugivorous lizards that we can actually do a really good job in making sure that we're meeting their needs by putting, you know, the necessary calcium, mineral, and vitamin A and such in these foods. So it makes it a little easier for the crested geckos as compared to like a leopard gecko. It's a little more challenging. So Jordan in the back. That's a great question. So the University of Florida is probably one of the best places to, they are constantly doing good quality research, and a lot of the research associates at the University of Florida have an interest in reptiles. UC Davis has done a lot of work recently with reptile and that help us with IBD in boas. And then you could literally do a search. You could look at some of the research papers that are coming out and say, and look where they've been generated from and say, hey, you know, I'd like to make a difference. Sort of like Petra said, planting a tree. Well, one way to plant a tree is to donate some money towards research for some of these diseases that we're concerned about, because we are concerned about it, because it's us. These are the animals that we love and care about, and so honestly the money has to come from us, but in order to help, you know, so I appreciate you're asking that question. And that's really, guys, that's how it's got to happen, is we all have to shoulder the responsibility of, okay, these are the animals we love, these are the animals that have maybe helped some of us to make a living. Don't we owe it to those animals to make a difference? I mean, we can't expect someone else to step up to the plate and do it, which unfortunately, I apologize, but the boa constrictor community, I'm just going to say it, they didn't step up. And so for all these years, we've had to deal with reptile because really, I mean, some people tried to get some funding together, but the funding just didn't happen. And then everybody's like, well, why aren't they figuring out a test? Well, because it's on us to figure out a way to donate and try to make that happen. Now the ARAV, the Association of Reptile and Amphibian Veterinarians, we have a research fund, and every year we have a big auction, and we usually generate about $5,000 to $10,000 of research money, and that goes into research projects for, you know, the herpetoculture community that there are some kind of conservation studies that happen through so the ARAV, Jordan, would be another place to donate, clinical-based, because there's clinical-based research funds that are put out there as well. So anyway. Yeah, in the back. Unfortunately, it's not good news. So we know that it is, we figured out that it is a virus, reptile, and there are basically two strains of it that we think we deal with. One is in the annulated boa, and then the other is the typical Colombian boa constrictor. And so those are the two that have been identified. It's been sequenced. Basically, the way they finally found it is there was a research group that thought it would be cool to do the DNA sequencing for a boa constrictor, because you know that kind of stuff used to cost like hundreds of thousands of dollars. So they actually laid out and put the research into finding out the genome, and then they found these other DNA components attached to it, if you will. And so basically they said, hey, what are these other, you know, genomes that are attached to this you know, genome of the boa? And that's how they were able to identify the reptile. So exciting stuff. Now the question is, what does it mean? So one of the concerns that we have is that there does appear to be vertical transmission with it. So there have been babies that have come up positive for reptile from adults. So our original thought, because I manage a fair number of clients that breed boa constrictors, and they're always asking me, like, you know, well, what can I do if I want to do my best, and how do I? So any animal that dies, we try to test, and that's one of the things I would encourage all you guys, that you should be, if you're not doing necropsies on your animals that are dying, and at least trying to get a gross evaluation of why they're dying. I mean, aren't you curious to know? You just lost one of your prized possessions. Don't you want to find out why it died, and if there was something different that you could do about it? And certainly if you're losing numbers of animals, that's a great way to try to get answers. So we start with gross necropsy, and then we can submit tissues and look for things like viruses. We have PCR. So back to the question. So we have good testing for, let's just call it IBD for ease of discussion. We have good testing for IBD. So there's a blood test, and then there's also, you can do PCR swabs. So the problem is always still that if it's negative, it isn't 100% for sure. In other words, you can get false negatives. So sometimes it might require that you do 2 or 3 tests on a particular animal in order to know for sure. One of the best ways, though, to really rule out is if you have an animal that dies and you do collect tissues from liver, brain, pancreas, and submit those. If those are clear and there's no IBD, then you can, with assurance, know that that animal was clean, and then hopefully you can get a better idea on how you're managing your collection. What we currently do with my boa breeders is that if we have positive animals, We basically identify and we try to isolate as much as we can any animals that have been around. So the idea is this is back to quarantine and back to keeping good records, which is all boring discussions, but so important, right? So if I know I put this male with these 3 females, if that male dies, then I know these 3 females are Scarlet Marys if potentially that male had IBD, and then I can at least identify those animals as potentially positive and begin to try to make decisions about how I'm going to pair up those animals. So the idea is to keep good records, test when you can test. Does it mean you should go through and completely destroy your entire boa collection? Of course not. But I think that there are logistical ways to try to work through it. But it is a frustrating disease. I will tell you that if you work with boa constrictors, it's going to be a problem for you, which is I think why a lot of people jumped over and started working with ball pythons. Of course, now we have the nidovirus concern with the ball pythons, and that's, of course, we probably brought that on ourselves with a lot of mixing and matching of animals with no quarantine. And then, of course, now we realize that nidovirus, whether it's, the idea is we don't know how many strains of nidovirus we have. We do know that there appears to be potentially maybe a different strain from Morelia. And of course, when we're talking about Morelia, we're, green tree pythons, of course, and then the carpet pythons that Nick has been talking about. Of course, they're a very big target as well, and as Philippe was mentioning also. The problem is it's out there, and we don't know exactly what it means. So I think the idea is to try to test and get an idea of the status of your collection, and then figure out the best way to be safe and manage it. But there's still a lot we don't know about nidovirus, so I hope that's helpful, yeah. That's a good question. So vaccination is, the potential is there that would probably, so there is no treatment for any of these viruses that we've been talking about, right, for IBD or for nidovirus. And most of the time these animals are dying from secondary bacterial infections. And so one of the things I think we can all think about, because we've all been doing this long enough, you think about all those like green tree pythons that came in that maybe didn't do that well and they would always die. Nidovirus didn't just suddenly show up. We've probably been dealing with it for years. And those are the ones that got thrown in the freezer and we didn't pursue like we should have or whatever, but maybe we didn't have the technology to find nido back then anyway. So a lot of these diseases that I think we're finding now, they've probably been happening all along, it's just we didn't have the technology to find them. And so we were assuming there was bacterial infections and treating for gram-negatives and stuff. And we still see bacterial infections in snakes with respiratory disease, but now unfortunately we have everything from nidovirus to IBD to mycoplasma to chlamydia. These are all the other special organisms that we can find in these snakes. And so, we have developed some techniques for actually doing lung biopsies on live snakes and having them survive it through endoscopy. We can make a very small incision between the ribs and go in with an endoscope and evaluate the lung and actually take small sample biopsies, and we can test for nidovirus, mycoplasma, chlamydia. So if you're having an issue, that's the idea, is there are ways that we can try to figure these things out. And again, the swabbing that we're doing for the PCRs, again, if that comes back negative, we can't be 100% sure, but a lung biopsy would probably be something that we could be sure about, or certainly have a lot more confidence in. As far as the vaccination goes, it didn't work very well for us on the bird side because we tried that with a few diseases and it didn't work very well. The diseases that we've had the most success with, again, I apologize, I'm comparing to the avian side, but it helps to make it fit. And we know reptiles are kind of birds anyway, right? Aren't they really? So they're uricotelic and all that fun stuff. So the idea was that we ended up, most of the diseases we got rid of by actually breeders stepping up and positive animals were culled. And a lot of those diseases were removed by people taking losses and removing actively positive animals. That's beak and feather disease, was a very prevalent viral disease that was horrific, that was on the powder down of the feathers of birds. And the classic thing that we used to see was that it was so contagious and infectious being in the dander that baby birds would be put on planes and be shipped from Florida to Virginia, and while they were in there, the dust that was left over from birds that were shipped a week earlier had the virus in it, and those baby birds were exposed and then got exposed to beak and feather disease. So that virus, again, now polyoma virus is a virus that we deal with birds that we have a vaccine for, and we can vaccinate baby birds for that. So there are things, and that would probably be the direction we would need to go with nido. Reptorrhinavirus, I'm not sure. That's a tough one because honestly, there's a big concern that maybe a very high percentage of boa constrictors out there have reptorhinavirus. There's debates that there may not even be any boas out there that don't actually have the virus. So there's some good research that still needs to be done about that. So, Alan. Well, these are fantastic questions from the point of view of production management, which, to be honest with you, that's my thing. That's what I'm get excited about, is helping people with situations like this. And yes, I think that, so you can, if the animal has died, the idea is, I think you guys are all sharp enough to know that, if there's a lovely odor coming from it and it's blown up and it looks like, it's getting ready to float away, then that's probably not an animal we can get a whole lot of information from. So don't ship that to me overnight. But if it's an animal, because we've had that happen, and you open it up and it's like, oh boy, yeah.
And can you freeze it, or can you?
All right. So for the problem with freezing is that when you freeze it, when you go to send in histopathology tissues, what happens is that the freeze-thaw process, those microscopic cells, they expand and rupture. So when the pathologist takes a look at the microscopic evaluation, they just see mush because all the cells have exploded, okay? So it's not as good for doing that detailed cellular look. However, you can still send me an animal and maybe I open it up and maybe there's a tumor in the liver or something. And I can tell you, hey, this looks like an obvious, or it has egg yolk coelomitis or something like this. Then maybe we check a box and say, hey, look, there's a good reason for this one. I think we're safe. We're not gonna, you can breathe. We're not gonna have a die-off, right? But so there's still some value in a gross evaluation. But most of the time, what we really want is we want to have an animal that's in good enough condition that we can collect small samples of the tissues that look abnormal, and we can submit those, and then we can do PCR testing for certain diseases and rule out some things for you to maybe hope you realize that maybe we aren't in a crisis. So overnight on ice, usually, it can be with the ice, just don't freeze it, Or if it's one where you're like, let's say it happens on a Saturday, and you want to send it to me on Monday, and then just go ahead and you can freeze it, and then we'll just do the gross. And even occasionally, I can still do PCR testing sometimes on some of those gross tissues. We just can't do the microscopic evaluation. But absolutely, yes, we have animals. Unfortunately, I don't think shipping companies are thrilled, but we do have animals coming from all over the country, both alive and dead, and we can work with them anyway. Yeah. Yeah. Vacuum pack. Interesting. I don't know. I've ever. I don't know. I think that would do a similar thing. I think that might be, yeah, I don't think, that probably isn't good either. Yeah, I think that would create too much damage to tissue, probably.
Depending on how much vacuum to put into the bag, wouldn't it?
I don't know. Does anybody else know the answer to that? I honestly don't know the answer to that. I've never had anything come to me vacuum packed, but doesn't mean it couldn't. Give it a go. Feel free. I'll let you know how it arrives on the other end. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. The thing is, I remind people too, remember that your veterinary stuff it's tax deductible. It's part of your business too, so you can write all that off. And it really depends, of course, on the size of your collection and all this kind of stuff. But I think the idea would be to try to set aside, some amount of money that you could use. I'll be honest with you, like when we do a full histopath workup on it, let's say you send me a dead animal and I'm very concerned about how things look, and I think, hey, we need to submit a bunch of tissues here and we might have to do some PCR. It might cost $500 or $600 to do a full workup on an animal, okay? We also have people ship us live animals to treat, and a lot of times when I do that, we will keep them for several weeks, so it costs a little bit more. If you ship me a snake with a respiratory infection and you want me to do all the testing, and usually we'll start treating it in my clinic and make sure it's healthy and then ship it back. But because we do a lot of reptiles, we actually have those fees. Like, we don't charge the same amount of money for a snake to stay overnight that we do Fluffy the bunny, because Fluffy the bunny is a lot more maintenance, right? And we try to make sure that the snake and the bunny don't get together or whatever. Did anybody else see the bunny with the tortoise this morning? Oh, that was pretty good. I was worried about that little bunny in there, but anyway. So I think the idea is that, I don't know, $5,000 to $10,000 would probably be a good amount of money just to sort of set aside as an insurance, depending on what animals you're working with. And I still will tell you that veterinary medicine is one of the best deals going. Honestly, we're super cheap, you guys, compared to. It's amazing to me how much more you guys expect from us than you do from your human doctor. I do a blood test on an iguana, and the owner calls me that night and says, "Where's my results?" And you have blood tests on themselves. 2 weeks later, the doctor still hasn't called, and they have to call the nurse. You guys are pissed off at us because we haven't gotten back to you within an hour, you know? And then you want it to be cheap, too, you know? Yeah, keep the cost low, doc, you know? So anyway, we're all just trying to, again, we're not probably getting real rich on the veterinary side, maybe at least not in the exotic animal world anyway. So we want to work with you. Yeah, Jordan again. Great question. And as far as the vaccine thing, I really didn't answer it. The problem with the vaccine, it would take about $100,000 to $200,000 of money to go into a research project for someone to, because then the company that makes the vaccine, they have to know that they're going to make, like for instance, ferrets. I do a lot of ferrets too, and we've had a few companies that tried to make a specific ferret distemper because they get canine distemper, but everybody wanted one to have a ferret picture on the bottle, and some of those companies went out of business because there weren't enough ferrets to make enough money. Everything is driven by money, even on the vaccine side. So you have to have a company that's willing to. So it would take a lot of us to get together. It doesn't mean it can't happen, but we got to group together to do it. And then back to your disinfect. So the good news is both of those viruses are they're pretty responsive to most disinfectants. So even good old-fashioned bleach, you know, at a half a cup per gallon works well for both of those. There are what we call non-envelope viruses that are a little more difficult to deal with, and for those, probably F10. To be honest with you, cryptosporidiosis is the most difficult organism to kill, and those oocysts are very, very tough. And the best disinfectant for them is actually full-strength ammonia. So the stuff you go buy from the drugstore, you just take that and just pour that in and use that. You don't dilute it, and it's super toxic, right? So try not to touch it. And whatever you do, don't mix it with bleach, because that could be really bad news. And then our meeting would be a lot smaller next year if you guys don't want to do that. So, although there's a few of us, we might want to get rid of each other. But anyway, no, kidding. So, but that was a good question, yeah. Yeah, this gentleman. So, good question. It's growing, no question about it. My clinic, we have 6 veterinarians full-time, and I have typically 2 interns and a resident going. So we actually train veterinarians in our practice to do avian and exotic, and of course reptiles are a big part of it. I mean, we probably have one of the biggest reptile practices in the country. And so we are, I call them kids now because I'm old. The kids are very excited about doing exotics. The problem is, as you guys know, is that this reptile thing is very different than any, like the birds, there's only like maybe a dozen parrots that we see, you know? And so a vet that's interested in birds can like figure out those 12 species, and then maybe there's a guy like Jordan in the back's got a few hookbills or something really, the hornbills that are really weird, but most of them, but when it comes to reptiles, we're talking about 7,500, 7,500, or maybe it's up to 10,000 species, and then you guys are coming up here giving us all these fabulous talks. So you gotta remember that it's very difficult for these guys to be sharp about all those species. They're not a bunch of, I'm like you, I feel like I'm one of you guys because I've been doing this for 30 years. I have a passion. So in my free time, I'm reading herp stuff, right? But most vets aren't necessarily gonna be like that. However, many of them are very interested, and the idea, if you find one that's interested, most of them understand now that they need your knowledge. You go to them and say, hey, I know everything there is to know about, the crested gecko, or well, let's pick a different species, something that's a little more unique, but they can still bring in the veterinary side of it, and they may be willing to work with you on it and do more of the consulting like we've talked about, like you bring in the fecal samples and things of that nature. So I do think that it's growing, and our ARAV group is growing every year. I think what's going to happen is there'll be more, like within a state maybe. Well, California is different. There's a lot more exotic animal vets here in California. But I think there's going to be more and more clinics like mine. There's probably, when I went to that practice in LA, there was like 3 in the whole country, and that was back in '88. Now there's probably 100 exotic animal exclusive clinics where they're just doing exotic animals. So anyway. So I'll be around, you guys, and then tomorrow we're going to talk about a whole bunch of reptile reproductive related veterinary topics. So I hope I'll have you guys come back tomorrow, and then you can drill me with some questions, but I'm getting yanked, it looks like. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you guys so much for watching through the end. I appreciate it. I'm sure Scott appreciates it too. There's a link down in the description where you can find information about Scott's book, Reptiles and Amphibians. And next week, we're going back to the Pomona Reptile Super Show to talk with Todd Joel of Unbelievaballs and check out some of the beautiful pythons that he's working with. Until then, you've been watching Triple B TV. Y'all take care.